Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're going to be talking with Commustar, aka Max, about tribes, tribalism, and nationalism in Africa. Max, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. So, before we get started, I wanted to ask what first interested you in history, and if there's any particular author who drew you into the field.
So, I've been interested in history for as long as I can remember. I have a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Massachusetts, but I think that my interest in Africa as a historical field really came after university, and it's really been my favorite African history author would probably be Jan Vansina. He's a giant in the field, and a lot of reading from him, Kingdoms of the Savannah, Paths in the Rainforest, How Societies Are Born, really was a highway to branching out into other aspects of African history. So,
perfect. So since we're going to be talking today about tribes and tribalism, we should probably define what is a tribe and what is tribalism.
Yeah, it has been a very challenging question to define tribe. We hear about tribes in popular culture. The Black Panther movie, in the background to the history of Wakanda, they mention 5 tribes creating the Kingdom of Wakanda. In newspapers, in the New York Times in 2007, they talked about tribal violence after the presidential election in 2007. And so I think a lot of people have this idea of tribe as a concept, as defining ethnic and political organization. But I think people assume it has a lot more meaning and a lot more clarity than it actually has been used in history among historians and among anthropologists. So I'm going to give a couple of different definitions that have been offered by anthropologists in the 20th century. Aidan Southall was an anthropologist, and he wrote the article "The Illusion of Tribe" in the year 1970. And in his definition, he says that a tribe is a whole society. It has a high degree of self-sufficiency at near subsistence level, meaning it would be a farming community or maybe a pastoral community. The self-sufficiency is based on a relatively simple technology. Tribe is without writing or literature. It is politically autonomous. It has its own distinct language, culture, and sense of identity. And tribal religion is usually coterminous with tribal society. The historian John Iliffe quoted the British Native Administration Memorandum of 1930 for the Tanganyika colony, saying that tribes possess a common language, they have a single social system, and an established customary law. Elman Service, who is a anthropologist associated with the neo-evolutionary paradigm in American academia in the 1960s, he gives tribes as part of the social political typology that includes bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. And he describes bands as small societies of maybe 25, 50, 100 members that are very mobile, low population density. They're foragers. They have an economy of generalized reciprocity, an egalitarian social structure, and a non-centralized political system. So decisions are made by groups' consensus. Tribes would be the next step up, hundreds to thousands of members. Where bands were mobile, semi-nomadic. Bands or tribes are semi-permanent. They live in a village or a non-mobile lifestyle. They depend on horticulture or pastoralism, and you have incipient status of you have incipient social differentiation. You have some elites, you have some um, peasantry. You have that division into social class, and you're starting to get the beginning of big men. And then next step up would sort of be the chiefdoms, where you have thousands of members. You have several different villages or more than one permanent community. You have agriculture. You have lineal descent. You have a centralized structure, but you don't quite have bureaucracy yet. And chiefdoms are characterized by having a chief. And then states, which would be the highest level of social organization, has many permanent communities, intense agriculture, clearly defined classes that are highly stratified, a centralized authority with formal offices and multiple governing bodies. And, the United States would be an example of a state in Elman Surface's political typology. And so if you compare Service's definition of a tribe to Aidan Southall's definition of a tribe, though those are two different things, that a lot of what gets termed a tribe in African history in the colonial era would be determined as chiefdoms by Service's typology. And lastly, the anthropologist Morton Freed wrote a book called The Notion of Tribe, and this is sort of a retrospective of anthropologists and the different definitions that they have used to describe tribe. And so he has a chapter that examines tribes as defined as breeding populations, or people who all are descended from one common belief, or claimed to be all descended from one common ancestor, and are all related to each other. Or a tribe as a linguistic grouping. The speakers of the language of Kikongo would all be the Congo tribe. Or a third definition would be a named group. So if you have people who all have a common identity and they call themselves the Congo, that would be called a tribe. Or they all have a common economic system. So you have an economic sphere where a tribe is interacting with each other and not interacting with outside economic system.
Yeah. So this is actually kind of surprising for me because, towards the end, I recognized the definitions more because it sounded like the more ethnicity and based tribes where everyone had the common ancestor. That kind of jives more with how I've seen tribes used, for example, in the ancient Greece and Rome, when the unification of these different tribes who founded different cities and things like that. But I'm kind of surprised at the definition, the much more the earlier definitions, which kind of sidestepped ethnicity and just focused on much more economic arguments. Because it kind of sounds like the discussions of the typology kind of reminds me of discussions around what is and isn't an empire, because it seems a lot less clear than I assumed it would have been.
Morton Freed makes this point that connecting it to the ancient tribes, Morton Freed says at the outset that tribe comes from the Roman. It's originally a Roman term, and it's also related to the Greek term ethnos. But the use of tribe in Africa by anthropologists, it comes from the idea of social evolution, and the idea that that African peoples were sort of, if you have a foot race and the Europeans are the fastest, that African peoples haven't quite evolved to the level of Europeans. So by looking backwards, modern savages in Africa in the 19th century would be sort of modern fossils, living fossils, where you could look at, where you could examine their lifeways and gain insight into the European past. The Celtic tribes could be used as an analogy to Bantu tribes.
Right. So it sounds like there's an underpinning assumption of a kind of lineal development of society. I mean, it's also kind of in Marxism too, of a lineal development of society along European lines, and you're either far along or not far along on that development.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And so fundamentally, what Aidan Southall determined and what Morton Fried determined is that this idea of tribe, Morton Fried gives all these different definitions and says, with all these competing definitions, tribe doesn't have one single definition, and all these definitions are they clash with each other, and it becomes incoherent. What Morton Fried is saying is that all of these different definitions have logical challenges associated with them, and that that the characterization of tribe as a term is not doesn't have a coherent meaning, and that you cannot really use it if it doesn't have a coherent meaning. It's not very useful for anthropologists.
So basically, there's this underpinning assumption of development along lineal lines, and it's not. And there have been criticisms of the use of tribes and as kind of even a category for Africa, which, based on what you've been saying, makes sense for it to be criticized, because it also reminds me of a different debate, but which kind of seems similar in a way, which is the debate around class, because there's been a long debate around whether class is an objective category that should be applied even in eras where people didn't necessarily think of society in terms of class. I mean, like, there would be segments of society, the priests, the warriors, that kind of thing, the nobles, but they wasn't necessarily class consciousness as we think of it today. And there's this huge debate between those who say that class is not an objective category and that it only makes sense to analyze class as a part of society in societies where class consciousness is a thing, as opposed to those who say class is an objective category and should be applied around, regardless of, when or where we're talking about. So, I mean, it kind of reminds me of that, the discussion of how up to what point tribe is a valid category for Africa. And I have to ask, like, where do you fall? Do you think that tribe is still, to some degree, a useful category to use for Africa, since conceivably Africans themselves probably didn't think of themselves in those lines? Or do you think that tribe isn't necessarily a useful category, at least for, pre-19th century Africa?
Tribe is not a useful terminology. It's not a useful category to think in terms of. And Aidan Southall has said that a lot of what we think of as tribes were creations of the colonial era. He gives the example of the Luhya people in what's now Kenya, near Lake Victoria, as a constructed tribe, as something created during the 1920s and the 1930s. Originally, it was the Kavirondo region was a term for this region next to Lake Victoria, and the peoples within that region had several different self-terms. There was 6 or 7 different terms for themselves, but they were administered in the colonial era as one people. And the British colonial administration relied on the idea of indirect rule, and part of that was relying on local chiefs to be to be like the interface between the the British administrators or the European administrators and the local the African populace in rural regions. And so the colonial era really it creates new novel political units, and they get ascribed as tribes in this year in new creation of political units that had not existed previously. The Luhya as an example of several 6 or 7 different peoples that hadn't really considered themselves as one people until the 1920s and 1930s, where they're administered as one people and they really start to think of themselves as one people.
That's really interesting. I had no idea that was something that happened even within Africa, because I know in the Americas, for slave traders, they would refer to these groups of people, the Congo, Caravali, Yoruba, and they would have all these categories where they would take maybe one real like identity group, and then they would kind of just be like, well, these guys are kind of the same thing, and then they'd push them into the same categories. So really these were artificial categories for these different nations as they were known in colonial era Cuba, African naciones. So it's interesting to know that this also is a phenomenon that happened within Africa and was also partially, largely a result of colonialism.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Yoruba, and that's another example where the historian C.D.Y. Peel has looked at the connections of missionary activity in West Africa, and prior to the 1800s, the Yoruba would have thought of themselves as several different communities, as Oyo. So Oyo is a city, and it was the capital of the Oyo Empire. And then there was the Ijefe, the Ile, the Ijesha. So there were several different peoples who they had this identity, largely centered around different city states within what is now southwest Nigeria, speaking different dialects of what is a fairly similar language, but with missionary activity in the 19th century. Missionaries need to translate the Bible. They needed to set a standard written format, and so they used the Oyo dialect to translate the Bible, and they converted local African peoples and sort of and created a sort of pan-Yoruba identity that, and emphasizing the sameness of these peoples as Yoruba in opposition to outside groups like the non-converted, non-Christian peoples, to the Muslim Hausa and Fulani of the north, to the Igbo people of the east.
Interesting. And so there's definitely it definitely evolved a lot under it definitely has a much tighter connection to colonialism than I would have first guessed. So you've got this this development during the colonial era. I mean, during the colonial era, does it go through different phases? Was it more like this the creation of these tribal identities more intense, more in the 19th century than in the early 20th century, or because I mean the colonial era in Africa is like almost stretches I mean, depending on where you are, it's several hundred years, but in some areas it's almost 100. So
it's hard to it's I don't yet have a sense whether it begins where it's more intense in the early era and the later. In southern Africa, there has been a lot of analysis on the connections of the creation of tribalism, the creation of ethnic identities, with the rise of industrialization, with mining economies in the copper belt of Zambia and in Katanga province in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and so you can see this creation of identities, creation of ethnic identities, or creation of tribes in the 20th century. And so I would say that it is more a 20th century phenomenon than a 19th century phenomenon.
okay, perfect. So as the 20th century advanced, these tribal identities also had to undergo, they had to change with the times, and you have, as decolonization progresses in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, you started having all these independent nations. What did the evolution of these tribal identities look like in an era of increasing attempts to create national projects for these African countries?
So you have something of two diverging trajectories in a lot. So in a lot of post-independence African nation states, you have a one-party political system. Like, for example, in Malawi, Hastings Banda becomes the president of Malawi basically from independence until the mid-1980s. Similarly, with Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda is the president of the country from 1964 to 1990. And so Leroy Vale wrote the book, The Creation of Tribalism in Southern Africa, and he really he gives an anecdote about his time in northern Malawi, speaking to a school teacher in northern Malawi who in speaking to several other people in northern Malawi at this time of the Biafra secession in Nigeria. So this would be 1967, 1968, and these northern Malawians were really saying that northern Malawi would be the next Biafra, and really playing up the amount of regional separation or regional separatism, and the idea that northern Malawians would create their own state. And so Leroy Vale really says that the increase in tribalism, or increase in ethnic identity in the immediate post-independence era, is a reaction to this one-party state, or that it is the manifestation of political resistance to the nationalism of the one-party state, and creating identities that challenge the one-party state by seeking refuge in your ethnic or tribal identity. So that's one end of the trajectory. And the other end of the trajectory, for example, you have Tanzania, you have Ghana. In Ghana, you had the first post-independence president is Kwame Nkrumah, and he effectively articulated an ideology of Pan-Africanism and socialism. So he articulates a ideology of he wants to create a United States of Africa, and in the late 1960s he is in negotiations with Senegal, in negotiations with Mali to create a sort of a regional multinational federation of West Africa as something just larger than just Ghana, where they would cooperate. And in Tanzania, the first president, Julius Nyerere, he's also arguing for Pan-Africanism, but also he's very active in the liberation of Zimbabwe, the liberation of South Africa from white minority rule, and for the total independence of Africa. And so in those nations, you have a more effective, you have two very charismatic presidents who are arguing for a greater political project, which in some ways is able to overcome the challenges of this opposition, this tribal opposition. And so in the 20th century, in the 21st century, we see much more muted expressions of ethnic identity, of tribalism, than in countries like Malawi or in like Nigeria.
And so so it sounds like they were trying to deal with kind of like two crises. Like there's on the one hand there's the problem that a lot of a lot of countries go through as they go through decolonization, which is that a lot of the borders are very, very arbitrary, and that oftentimes, especially in Latin America and I think as Africa as well, you have to maintain those borders, the old colonial borders, even if they have very little to do with the ethnic, religious, or other kinds of identities which dominate the region. But on top of that, they have all these tribal identities that were largely a byproduct of intended or unintended of colonialism, and combined with already existing identities. And so it's just it sounds like a horrible mess.
So to speak to the issue of borders, the Organization of African Unity was it was comparable to the European Union, or it's a multinational federation that, and it has since 2000 it has been superseded by the African Union, but it was a organization where African leaders would meet and they would try to plan out and resolve issues that affected the continent of Africa. And in 1964, they issued the Cairo Declaration, where they said that they would, in order to avoid a sort of chaotic situation of redefining borders, avoid interstate conflicts around the issue of redefining borders, that all African states, all members of that Organization of African Unity, would commit to preserving the colonial era borders as inherited at independence. And the only exceptions would be that borders could be redefined by the mutual consent of both parties that would be affected. So if Nigeria and Benin wanted to change their border and both sides agreed, then they could change the border. But that declaration froze the border, and there has been actually very little interstate conflict in Africa since independence, and really the only example of a border war I would actually say there are only two examples that I can think of of wars that sought to change the border, and one of them would be the Ogaden War in 1977, where Somalia tried to annex eastern Ethiopian territory where ethnic Somalis lived, called in the Ogaden region, hence the name Ogaden War. And in that war, Somalia was defeated by Ethiopia with support from Ethiopia was supported by Cuba and by the Soviet Union. And then the other example that I would be able to think of would be in not Angola. The other example I would think it would be in 2000 with Eritrea, which it had been part of it had been associated in a federation with the Empire of Ethiopia, and then after the Ethiopian Revolution, it had been from 1960 basically. It fought a war for independence from Ethiopia and from the Empire of Ethiopia, and then from the Derg and the Socialist Republic of Ethiopia. And so in 2000, after Eritrea had gained independence, there was also a border war to determine exactly where the border lay. But other than that, there have not really been any wars to change the borders of African states.
So would you say that so this political project at least prevented very many cases of wars to change borders, but would you say that in more recent times these projects have been a success or a failure? Can you use any examples? Or
the major example. So the previous statements I made was specifically about interstate conflict to adjust borders, but there have been several secessionist movements. So the most famous example would probably be the example of Biafra, which the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria tried to secede from the rest of Nigeria and create their own Republic of Biafra. And that had a lot to do with that came immediately after a coup by Igbo officers, and then a counter coup by non-Igbo officers, and pogroms against Igbo peoples in areas of central and western Nigeria. And so it led to a secessionist war and a war between 1967 and 1970, where the Federal Republic of Nigeria fought to bring Biafra back into the Republic of Nigeria, because it was their position that you cannot secede from Nigeria, and they were successful.
So basically, we haven't seen wars trying to decide this, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the projects themselves have been these national projects, or at least where Pan-African projects have been successful in creating identities that replace the more localized tribal identities. So would you say that these national projects have been successful anywhere?
So I guess I wouldn't overemphasize what Leroy Vale is saying, because what he was saying was a remarking on a period from the 1960s, maybe to the 1970s, with the immediate failure of the immediate post-independence generation of leadership to articulate a national program. But in the 1980s and in the 1990s, there was a widespread movement in Africa towards multi-party competitive elections. And and that was successful in many instances in Zambia, in Malawi, uh, in 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 Tanzania. It created multi-party competitive elections, and you had changes in leadership. You had the transfer of leadership from one party to another, and so I think that the conditions that Leroy Vale was remarking on that um, emphasized tribalism as a refuge from the dominant party, one party state, has shifted and has gone away since the 1990s, where there are now competitive multi-party elections.
Perfect. So let's see. Um, Perfect. So what would you say are some of the what would you say are some of the major challenges, not necessarily to facing the field at the moment, or this topic, but maybe better understanding on a popular level of this topic? Because as listeners have probably guessed by most of the episodes that we've done, and the depth and the focus of a lot of these episodes, there isn't there we do try to talk about African history, but there doesn't really, I include myself in this, there isn't as good an understanding, even with people who consider themselves to be well-rounded in there's not as much of a background in African history, I guess I'm trying to say. What do you think would be some solutions to try and get these issues better understood in the popular mindset, and even in academia?
So I think so. At the outset, I quoted the New York Times coverage of the 2007 election in Kenya, and the persistent use of tribal violence to explain what happened. And so tribe is used a lot to explain otherwise inexplicable things in African politics nowadays. And so I think that the media, newspapers, have a lot of responsibility to try and and reporters have a responsibility to be self-conscious in understanding the origins, the intellectual history of the concept of tribe, and to avoid using the term tribe as this simple explanation for otherwise very confusing and messy processes. So going back to the Kenya election of 2007, the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote he wrote about the myth of tribe in Africa, the myth of tribe in African politics, where he pointed out how the violence after the election was sort of presented as ancient hatreds between the Luo people and the Kikuyu people of Kenya. But the Luo people and the Kikuyu people don't share any border. Historically, they haven't lived next to each other. And and sort of pogroms against Kikuyu people in 2007 didn't necessarily happen in Luo inhabited areas in the west of the country, but it happened specifically in Kalenjin areas. And this violence and the politics of Kenya, you have sort of party coalitions where the Luo and the Kalenjin and different ethnicities sort of work together, and they are sort of they are arguing for developmental projects in their region, or they are looking for the movement of state resources towards their region. So basically, what Ngugi wa Thiong'o is arguing is that he's arguing that these culture brokers, sort of political elites or famous people among the Kikuyu people, are arguing for sectionalist and tribal grievances against the Luo people, even though these culture brokers, these elites, are very wealthy, and perhaps they made their wealth from connection to state resources. They are sort of directing people's attention to the other ethnic groups in the community, in the country, to distract from the sort of class differences within a tribe or ethnic community.
I get what you're saying. So it's not this mysterious and backwards kind of like ethnic or tribal identity issue. That's just kind of like an excuse, or kind of like
I think it's that specific people, specific leaders, or specific leaders latch onto that to sort of direct attention away from themselves, direct it towards to create narratives of outsiders as the cause of problems,
as a matter of misdirection.
Right.
No, that makes sense. I mean, Europe is pretty familiar with that. I'd guess with the history of the Jews in Europe, who were blamed for countless things and repeatedly expelled or had pogroms committed against them in England, France, Spain, Venice. I mean, basically everywhere. So Europe isn't immune to that either. Well, and of course Hitler. Perfect. Now, do you have any kind of like are there any advances in popular understanding of this topic, or progress in how it's treated in maybe popular media or news sources? Something that you'd like to highlight as a sign of progress, or is it just a really, really not well understood thing that that there hasn't been much progress on?
Yeah, I'd have a bit of trouble coming up with an example offhand. I think it's sort of, I think this is a good demonstration of the differences between sort of academic understandings of a concept and popular or media representations of it.
Well, I mean, without necessarily coming up with a specific example, like just like the specific any kind. Have you noticed like no change in really how this is handled, or have you noticed like a slight improvement in how it's handled in the media or something? Or
I do think that I have noticed that, the New York Times again more recently has tended towards using ethnicity rather than the term tribe. But again, I think it is baked into people's assumptions that are basic into people's subconscious that Africa is tribe, and so it's something that I think we're going to be having to talk about for years and years and years.
Perfect. And Is there any kind of book or article? Maybe you could link it in the subreddit thread about for the podcast episode. But do you think there are some things that people could read up on if they want to brush up on this problem?
Yeah. I mean, I'd point to Aidan Southall, Morton Freed. I'll link Ngugi wa Thiong'o's article. There's just an enormous body of literature in anthropology and in African history that talks about this, and there are new directions of Chaparuka Kusimba has looked at ethnic mosaics in pre-colonial Kenya, looking at how different communities had pursued specific economic strategies like pastoralism, hunting, farming, and interacted with each other and cooperated with each other to create what Dr. Kusimba calls a ethnic mosaic in the Tsavo region of Kenya. So there are some very exciting new directions in the study of ethnicity and tribalism in contemporary Africa and in pre-colonial Africa.
Great. Well, Max, thanks again for coming on and talking to us.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for coming on.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.